Hi, I'm Ken Adams, your host for Valley View, and this week we're going to be discussing the economic policies around Oregon and is it a really good business climate? And I've invited Tyler MacInnis from the Oregon Center for Public Policy to talk a little bit about economic conditions here in Oregon, and is it good for business or not? Because I've heard a lot of times politicians saying, oh, we have this horrible business climate here in Oregon. So I thought maybe you could help shed some light on the subject.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. So just briefly a little bit about us at OCPP, the Oregon Center for Public Policy. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. We're a little think tank, and we do tax and budget and economic analysis, and we try to advance public policies that improve the economic conditions for all Oregonians, particularly low and middle income working Oregonians.
People that work for a living.
People that work for a living, exactly. And so what that means is, we do analysis of like the kind that you've described in the introduction. We publish fact sheets and things like that, and all of the materials are on our website, which is ocpp.org, and we encourage folks to visit us there.
And check it out for themselves.
Absolutely.
And the methods you're using, you tell us about what those methods are so that we can verify.
Yes, all of our analyses are documented on our publication, so people can dig in a little bit more if they want to.
So how does Oregon rate against other states as far as being a good place for businesses to come and set up shop, basically?
Oregon, by a number of measures, does quite well economically. We've done some recent analysis to look at how Oregon compares in overall economic growth compared to other states. And what we find is that Oregon ranks second amongst all states in terms of overall economic growth over the last 13 years. The same is true when you look at that measure from a per person measure. So adjusting economic growth for population growth to see if that has any impact. And the same is true. Oregon ranks second, trailing just North Dakota, I think. And so there's a number of these measures that tell us that Oregon is doing quite well. Oregon's workers, for instance, are some of the most productive in the country. And even corporate America, in their own publications that they put out, they often cite Oregon as a great place to set up shop and do business.
And part of that is the environment as well, because we do have clean water, clean air compared to a lot of places in the country. And I think a lot of times people start talking about business climate, they start talking about deregulating environmental controls as well as giving tax breaks to companies and like that. And we've seen some of giving tax breaks to big companies here in Oregon. But, and part of my experience has been with the National Football League, is that they'll get people to, and we don't have to worry about that so much here in Oregon, but they'll get cities to compete against each other to build them a brand new stadium that costs $500 million or $1 billion, and with very little economic gain as a result. And we see that not just with football, but I like using that because a lot of times people see that in action all the time, is that businesses will try to work one location against another to try to get them to give them either tax breaks or some sort of incentive to set up shop in this particular state or whatever state they're doing.
Well, I think what you said at the beginning of your question there about Oregon's environment is very true. And what we know is that there's a lot that goes into how a business decides to locate in a particular place. And oftentimes it has to do with quality of life and the public structures that are available for their employees. There's a narrative that's kind of out in the world there that a state's tax structure really is the driving force behind whether or not a company will choose to locate in one place or another. There's been some research done that shows that that's not really the case, but even if we assume that that's true, if we assume that tax systems are driving businesses to one location or another, when we look at how Oregon fares, the corporate America finds that Oregon has some of the lowest effective business tax rates in the country. So even if that assumption is true, if you agree with that assumption, Oregon is a great place to do business. But really, what it comes down to is having really strong public structures, like good education for our kids, great quality of life. Having Oregon has beautiful natural scenery all around the state, and these are the kinds of things that really help determine where a business is going to set up shop and remain and stay in place.
Right. Well, I have to laugh because my uncle was a plant manager for Borg Warner, and this is back in the 60s. And he was tasked to set up a new facility because he was like in the greater Los Angeles area, and they were just finding it too congested to get work done. And so they had him just check all over the United States to set up a new factory. So he picked Keokuk, Iowa. He didn't even last a year there because the tornadoes coming through just, wasn't something he was prepared to deal with. And there were other problems that came up that, and I think a lot of them did have to do with environment and just not being, he was kind of centrally located as far as the country is concerned, but he was kind of off track as far as interstates and other ways of shipping things and like that. So it's there's a lot of things that go into where a company will set up if they're looking for a new location or a better location.
Absolutely. I mean, I myself, I'm a Massachusetts native, and Massachusetts is often looked at as having really great public universities, and that's a reason why a lot of companies will choose to locate there. Oregon has some really great universities of its own, and so having skilled workforce available, that high quality of life, good public education systems, these are the things that companies are really looking for when they choose to locate.
The other thing that quite often comes up is about minimum wage. And Oregon has one of the highest minimum wages. And so that has not really been a detriment then either. And even when they start talking about $15 an hour, people get all upset and say we're going to lose jobs. But every study I've ever seen has knocked that down. But they still keep making that comment about, well, we're going to lose jobs as a result.
That's true. There's been extensive research done on the minimum wage. It's one of the most heavily studied topics in economics, going back over the last few years and decades, really. And this issue of whether or not raising wages causes job loss is one of the most researched topics within that field of researching minimum wage. And consistently, the research shows that marginal increases in the minimum wage don't have any positive or negative effect on employment. And so, it's a concern that obviously comes up whenever discussion of raising wages comes up. But the literature shows us that it hasn't happened, really.
Well, and also I look at the example of Germany, and they try to keep their high-tech jobs in place for their workers, and they pay their workers extremely well because it's cutting-edge stuff, and they don't worry so much about the lower jobs, that can be outsourced throughout Europe and like that. They don't worry about those, but they try to make sure that the high-paying jobs stay in Germany. And to me, that's kind of a good example of what maybe we should be doing, not just here in Oregon, but in the United States, trying to protect those jobs that pay well and try to keep our workforce up to date and educated for those kinds of jobs.
Absolutely, and I think the conversation that's happening right now around the minimum wage, I think it brings up a lot of important points about what's happening in Oregon's economy right now, and namely, or a large point there being is that income inequality and poverty are some of the biggest challenges facing our state economy at the moment. So, as we were talking about earlier, the business community is doing quite well. As a whole, the economy is doing quite well, but the gains aren't really being shared amongst all Oregonians. Increasingly, we're seeing families living in poverty despite the fact that they're working. In 2013, for instance, 7 out of 10 families living in poverty had at least one person in the household that worked. And 2 out of 5 children living in poverty in 2013 had at least one parent that worked full time. And so what these numbers tell us is that increasingly work isn't paying. We're not paying enough to support a family. And so this conversation around raising wages, really what we're talking about it's a conversation about values and what kinds of communities we want to see.
And I guess I get frustrated because I've seen people doing very kind of skilled work for very little money.
Yes.
And it just seems to me that we need to honor that, or we're going to have bigger problems at some point. I mean, people can only be on the edge for so long before they decide that this just isn't working for us.
Sure, and I think this raises an important point too. It's something that is a shared value across the political spectrum, is this idea of self-sufficiency, or another way of saying it is the idea that someone who works, especially folks who are working full-time, should be able to support themselves and support a family. And this idea that work should pay enough to support someone is something I think that most folks could agree with. But increasingly we're seeing, and this isn't just an Oregon problem, this is a problem nationally, but we're seeing that wages are simply too low to support families. And so this effort to raise Oregon's minimum wage, it's not a silver bullet solution. There's a number of things that need to happen to improve the economic opportunities of working people, especially here in Oregon. But raising the minimum wage to $15 would be a major step in the right direction.
And I go back to my own childhood where just my dad worked. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, but he made enough money so we had spending money. Mm-hmm. It wasn't like we lived in poverty or anything. And I mean, I find today's economy where you sometimes have both parents working and the kids going to daycare and they're just barely scraping by is very stressful, for one thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're shortchanging not just the current generation, but the next generation as well, because a lot of times they're, like I say, they're in childcare, which a lot of times is good, but I mean, sometimes you need family, and we're working more hours, and it creates a lot of stress in the family as well as the society, because people don't have the extra time to go out and do things.
Absolutely, and I think something. I think it'd be good to maybe share some good news as to what could happen if we were to raise the minimum wage to $15. And so we've done some work with some partner organizations to come up with some preliminary estimates as to what would the impacts of raising the wage to $15 be. And so some of those things are, we know that over 500,000 Oregon workers would see a raise directly as a result of raising wages to 15. We know that another 114,000 workers would see their wages rise indirectly, and that means folks who are currently making a little bit above 15 who would probably see their pay bumped up as employers adjust pay ladders. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of working Oregonians seeing a raise. We know that 350,000 children roughly would have at least one parent impacted by the raises. And in total, all the workers who are seeing their wages rise as a result, should this effort be pushed through House Bill 2009, which is the bill for 15. We know that all the workers that would see a raise by the year 2018, when the wage was fully phased in, they will have seen an additional $3.2 billion in their wages. And we know that low wage workers tend to spend their money, and that's because they don't have enough money, right?
Right.
So
they're doing without things in the meantime.
They're putting off perhaps a utility payment 1 month, or perhaps they're waiting to get the repair they need on their car. They're holding off for a little while longer until they can come up with some more money. And so we know that this $3.2 billion figure is important, because we know that this is money that's largely going to be spent in local economies, back into small businesses and people's communities. And so we're talking about really significant earnings in the pockets of working people.
So what is the status on that bill 2009?
The status is ongoing. There's a hearing coming up on April 13th, which will be the first public hearing on a number of minimum wage bills, but that one in particular, that's the one that is garnering the most attention. There's going to be a big public hearing at the Capitol. We encourage folks to please come out and attend that on April 13th. If they visit our Facebook page, they can look for us for Oregon Center for Public Policy on Facebook. We'll have information about the public hearing on our Facebook page there. So that's going to kind of kick off a lot of the efforts to pass this legislation.
So, we were talking about Oregon as it relates to the, United States. So that means that Oregon does pretty well compared to its neighbors then as well, right? California and Washington and Idaho and so on. And is that true?
I can't recall offhand where Washington, Idaho, and California fare in those analyses, but certainly Oregon is faring better by a number of
Because
measures.
only North Dakota is doing better.
Correct, correct, right.
And that's a lot because of the oil boom, I would imagine.
I believe North Dakota, yes, because of the oil boom.
The other thing too that North Dakota has is their own bank, so they can loan out money to the businesses to kind of get things rolling too, as a way of doing business. And I've always found that very interesting, that the United States as a whole does their banking through all these companies that make a lot of money, say like on student loans and things like that, whereas if the money was coming into the government, that means we'd probably be paying lower taxes as a result.
Perhaps, yes. Yeah.
But I mean, it's just something that I find interesting about North Dakota, because it's the only one with an actual bank, a state bank that you can go to.
That is a unique feature. Yeah, yes. But I think I think for Oregon, an interesting thing in terms of looking at how it fares against other states is it reinforces this idea that, you know, Oregon has a great quality of life and is appealing for so many reasons, a wide variety of reasons.
You know, one of the other things too I've kind of noticed about Oregon is they are saying that some of the larger cities here in Oregon have recovered, but some of the more rural areas have not. And that's because they quite often use natural resources as a way of getting income, and that can vary a lot in how much the return is going to be. Is there anything that could be done specifically for rural parts of the state that might help the economy in those areas?
I mean, it's true that the Portland metro area has driven a significant portion of the growth in the state. You know, it is a driving factor in the economy. I think that when it comes to rural areas, there's a number of things that can be done. I think raising wages is a good thing to do in a number of these communities, because it would inject some money back into local economies, and that in and of itself can be a real benefit to businesses.
So what other kind of work does the Oregon Center for Public Policy get involved in? Or what kind of things are you seeing that maybe the public hasn't seen, you know, from your studies and like that?
Sure. So I can share a few things that we're currently working on with this legislative session. So I've mentioned minimum wage many times before. That's a big priority for us right now. Something else we're working on is passing wage theft protections for Oregon workers. And what wage theft is it's kind of this umbrella term or a catch-all term that describes various ways that some employers, a small number of employers, can refuse to pay wages that workers have earned. And so this can happen in a number of ways.
Well, could you give me an example? Because
sure.
I'm kind of curious about how that works.
It's a phenomenon that kind of goes undiscussed, and I think it's an important one to discuss. So an example would be, say, a restaurant worker who part of their earnings come from tips, and a restaurant owner doesn't pay their tips out at the end of the night. Or perhaps someone is forced to work off the clock, or they work overtime hours and aren't compensated for overtime. There's a number of ways in which wages that someone has earned are withheld from them when they actually get their paycheck. And so, currently the way it works is if a worker feels they're having their wages stolen from them, they're able to go to the Bureau of Labor Industries, BOLI, and they can file a claim. And then BOLI can kind of investigate, and if they find that the employer has wrongfully kept wages from an employee, they can try to make the employer pay, but oftentimes they don't pay even after they're found to have taken wages from employees.
How do they get away with that? I mean, because they have no enforcement?
There's a number of ways in which they can get away with it. But what our effort would do, there's a bill that's being pursued now in the legislature that would strengthen BOLI's ability to recoup those wages. And hopefully it would end up encouraging more workers to come forward when they experience this, because we know many don't actually.
Well, and I would imagine during the investigation and everything else that goes on, say a worker goes and reports this and there's an investigation, well, not only do they not have the money, but their bills are still coming in.
Sure.
And it seems that it would only be fair that they not only get the lost wages, but interest at least on those wages for their hardship. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I
Certainly,
don't
yeah.
see how somebody can steal somebody else's money and then not even have to pay it back, and or at least in a situation where you're working for somebody.
And I think you raise an important point to understand when it comes to wage theft, and that is that often we're talking about low wage workers. So we're talking about folks working in the restaurant industry. We're talking about people who are working service industry jobs, and oftentimes, people who are living paycheck to paycheck are the ones who are experiencing wage theft. And so we are pursuing a bill, and we're hopeful that it will pass this session that would strengthen protections that workers have and enable more workers to come forward and actually recoup those wages.
So is somebody actually resisting that bill going through?
There's
Not out loud, maybe.
no particular. I mean, the bill has a lot of widespread support. There's a lot of coalition partners that we've been working with that support the effort. The BOLI itself is supportive of the effort. So it is a bill that a lot of folks are supportive of and understand the issue. So we're hopeful that it'll pass.
Yeah, because I would imagine like a restaurant worker who doesn't get paid at some point will probably just get fed up and quit and go to work someplace else, and maybe they're counting on things like that, figuring that, oh, okay, if I lose them, I can find somebody else to do that job, for a minimum wage, and I can steal for him for a while, and but I mean, to me, it seems awfully short-sighted because you have workers who aren't real happy, and at a restaurant, I don't know if that would be such a good thing.
Likely not. And actually, in terms of minimum wage, you bring up a good point, and that is when we start talking about the costs of rising wages, right? A lot of the research that's out there shows us that turnover is very costly to employers, and the cost of recruiting and training new employees can be a major expense to employers. And so one of the ways that employers are able to adjust to increased minimum wages is that their employees are happier, they're more productive, they tend to stay on the job, and that lowers costs through being able to retain those employees and not having to spend on recruiting and training new employees.
Well, it's funny because I've worked in the tech industry for a long time, and I remember a boss saying, well, we need to get rid of so-and-so. And I said, why? He said, well, he's not that good. He's just like a C worker. And I said, what are your chances of hiring somebody higher than a C worker for the money you're paying? He said, what do you mean? I said, we're an insurance company. We don't pay top dollar wages. It's not like we're manufacturers or something. So the chances are that you're going to get somebody better are somewhat less than 50-50. Mm-hmm. And so he had never thought of it that way. And I said, sometimes what you need to do is work with what you have, because at least you know that they're dependable. They show up every day. That's, maybe they're not going to be suitable for advancement, but they do their job okay. We can get by with it. And your chances of going out and finding somebody better aren't that good.
Right, and there's been really good research done by the Center for American Progress that shows just how expensive recruiting and training new employees can be, and it's a significant cost to some, especially in some industries, particular industries. I would imagine in the industry that you described, it's fairly costly for an employer to go out and find a suitable replacement for somebody. So there are a number of ways that raising wages can actually be beneficial to businesses, and improved employee retention, improved employee productivity. Those are just a few of the ways that it can actually be a benefit to businesses.
Yeah, because I've seen employees, what they do is they wait till, especially in the tech industry, okay, is they'll wait till they get a raise and then they'll go out job hunting, because then they can get a second raise on top of it.
That strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean, because if they feel like they're not being paid enough, that's one of the strategies that they will, if somebody really wants to, maximize how much they're making, that's one way of doing it. Whereas if the company would just pay them what they're really worth, or close to it at least, they would probably stay and realize that they could advance in this company and be paid well for it. And a lot of times that is not really looked at by management or employers. And I find it very short-sighted, because especially in the tech industry, a lot of times the information is mostly utilized for that particular company, and it doesn't transfer well other places. And it means people coming in have a long period of learning before they're really useful.
Right. 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 And so, I think you bring up a good point about, people they're looking for other jobs because wages are low, and this is a trend that we see, not just in Oregon but nationwide. This is a major structural problem that we have in our economy right now. And so, raising the minimum wage, enacting wage theft protections, these are just a few of the ways that we can begin to ensure that people are paid better and actually are paid for their work. And there's a whole wide range of policy solutions that can go to improve the lives of working people in Oregon, but those are just a handful.
Yeah, and I would imagine having good, like, say, the community colleges. If people need to be retrained, they need to make sure that they can go, say if you've been working for a few years and want to either change careers or you need to up your skills. That's another thing that needs to happen within the state, that they have to have a good education system so people can get retrained.
Absolutely, and I think something that we're concerned with, not just this session, but long term, and something that we seek to do in our work every day is, making sure that the state is investing in those public structures. So community colleges, K through 12, pre-K, a lot of the public infrastructure that, that makes Oregon an attractive place to come and set up a business. That makes Oregon a place that so many people choose to relocate to. These are the sorts of public structures that we really need to make sure that we're investing in moving forward. And so, our long-term work is really looking at making sure that we're making those investments and making sure that we're doing them at the right levels. And what that really means is coming up with more revenue.
And if people are making more money, they're paying more in taxes then, right?
That's true. They would be paying more in taxes. Yes.
And those smaller businesses that rely on people that are making good money also increases their revenue, and they get to pay more taxes as well. I mean, it kind of flows through the system.
It does. I mean, I think something that is also worth discussing here is, when voters enacted measures 66 and 67, which raised the corporate minimum taxes,
right,
in 2010, the idea there was that corporations should be paying their fair share, and they should be equal partners in investing in these public structures that we all care about and rely on. What's happened since then is a suit was brought by the trucking company Conway, and they said that they should be able to reduce their tax liability against the new corporate minimum tax by using tax credits. And the Supreme Court in Oregon said, okay, well, they agreed with their arguments and said that the way the law was drafted was allowed them to do that. So since that decision, we've seen hundreds of corporations reduce their tax liability, and most of them are not paying the corporate minimum tax. In fact, we just published a fact sheet this week that shows 492 corporations in Oregon use tax credits to pay less than or pay no corporate minimum tax.
Well, Tyler, we're going to have you come back and discuss that more fully the next time.
Absolutely.
And so this has been the Valley View, and thank you for watching.